The morning light slipped through the thin curtains of the small one-bedroom apartment on the east side of town, washing the walls in a muted gold. Malik Johnson stirred awake to the sound of his grandmother's old gospel records playing softly from the kitchen. The familiar hum of Mahalia Jackson's voice always meant the day had begun. Malik lay still for a moment, listening, grounding himself in the ritual that had carried him through years of quiet struggle. His grandmother, Miss Evelyn, had raised him since he was 8 years old, and though her hair had long since turned silver and her hands trembled when she poured her coffee, her spirit was a steady compass in his life. He rose and slipped on his neatly pressed waiter's uniform, always careful to keep it spotless, the crisp white shirt tucked in sharply, the black tie knotted with precision. Malik believed dignity was found in the details, the small, quiet decisions to carry yourself with care even when the world did not care for you. He padded into the kitchen where Miss Evelyn sat at the table, her Bible open beside a chipped mug. She looked up at him with a tired but proud smile. "Morning, baby," she said, her voice rasped with age but still warm. "You got that long shift tonight?" "Yes, ma'am," Malik replied, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head before pouring himself coffee. "They got some big corporate dinner. You know how it is." She nodded, watching him with the same eyes that had once watched his father walk out and never return. Her gaze lingered on him now with a mix of worry and hope, as though she knew he was carrying not just his own dreams, but hers too, on his way out. Malik paused by the mantel in the living room where his diploma hung in a modest frame. He had finished his MBA the year before, studying by night and working double shifts by day. The degree wasn't just a piece of paper. It was proof that he had fought his way through systems meant to grind him down. He touched the frame lightly before heading out, a small ritual of affirmation. The country club was just across town, but felt like a different world. The drive there cut through neighborhoods that told the story of America's unspoken divides. First arose of small, weather-worn houses with peeling paint and kids playing cracked driveways. Then suddenly the manicured lawns, brick mansions, and iron gates where the town's wealthiest lived. Malik parked in the employee lot, tucked behind the dumpsters where no member would ever have to see it. Inside, he moved with the rhythm of practiced grace, balancing trays, anticipating orders before they were spoken, navigating the dining room without making a sound. To the wealthy men and women seated at the linen-covered tables, he was nearly invisible, and Malik had learned long ago that invisibility could be both a cage and a shield. He worked with quiet efficiency, speaking politely when addressed, but never more than necessary. When he had a spare moment, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Amelia. "Can't wait to see you later." He couldn't help but smile, a small flicker of light breaking through the day's routine. She was a secret he kept closest to his chest, a woman from the very world that dismissed him, yet someone who had seen him, really seen him, beyond the uniform. Their love was a quiet rebellion, tender and deliberate, sheltered from the storm they both knew would come if her family ever found out. As the afternoon sun slid toward evening, Malik stood at the service station polishing silverware, his reflection faint in the glass cabinet. He caught sight of himself, tie straight, posture upright, eyes steady. He carried himself with a calm resilience, but beneath it all lay the weight of unspoken battles. The world saw a waiter. Malik saw a man preparing for something greater, though he could not yet name what was coming. The chandeliers of the country club glowed warm and golden that night, their light reflecting off crystal glasses and polished silver. The dining hall had been transformed for the evening. White roses arranged in tall vases, a string quartet playing softly in the corner, and the long tables filled with the town's most powerful families. For Malik, it was just another event, another night of smiling through clenched teeth, but the tension in the air felt sharper, heavier. The guest of honor was Charles Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Industries, and one of the wealthiest men in the state. He was also Amelia's father. Malik knew Charles by reputation. Everyone in town did. He was the kind of man who wore his success like armor, who spoke as though the world belonged to him. Tonight, he sat at the head of the table, a glass of scotch in hand, his booming laughter filling the room. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly groomed, his tailored suit pressed to perfection. Around him sat other men of power, their wives draped in silk, their conversation dripping with the certainty of people who had never been told no. Malik approached with a tray of champagne flutes. Moving silently, his eyes downcast. He set the glasses on the table with practiced precision, but before he could step back, Charles's voice cut through the chatter. "Well, now," Charles said, his tone sharp with amusement, "this young man looks far too serious for a party. Tell me, son, do you ever smile, or do they train that out of you when you put on the uniform?" The table erupted in polite laughter, the kind that carried an undercurrent of cruelty. Malik straightened slightly, his jaw tightening. He forced a small professional smile, the same one he had worn 1,000 times before, and murmured, "Just doing my job, sir." But Charles wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Doing your job. And what job is that, really? Serving drinks, clearing plates. Not much of a future in that, is there?" The laughter grew louder this time, some of the guests covering their mouths as if they were embarrassed, but not enough to stop. Malik felt the heat rise in his chest, but he kept his face calm, his hands steady on the tray. Charles leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as if he were studying a specimen. "Let me give you a piece of advice, son. Men like you stay in uniforms. You don't end up in boardrooms. That's just the way the world works. Best you learn that now." The words hung in the air like smoke. Even the quartet seemed to falter for a moment before continuing their soft melody. Malik's ears buzzed with humiliation, but he swallowed it down, keeping his gaze fixed on the tablecloth. He thought of his grandmother, of the way she had taught him that dignity was not what others gave you, but what you carried inside yourself. He thought of Amelia, of her smile that reminded him he was more than what they saw. So he said nothing. He simply bowed his head slightly, gathered the empty glasses, and stepped away. His silence was not weakness. It was control. Across the room, Amelia had arrived late, slipping quietly into a chair at the far end of the hall. She had witnessed just enough to understand what had happened. Her father's laughter, Malik's bowed head. It was a scene that cut her to the bone. She clenched her hands beneath the tablecloth, her knuckles whitening, but she said nothing. Not yet. As Malik disappeared into the kitchen, Charles Whitmore raised his glass for a toast. "To success," he declared, his voice booming. "To knowing your place in the world." The guests cheered, glasses clinking. But at the edge of the room, in the quiet shadows, Malik stood with his tray pressed against his chest, the words echoing in his mind. He knew this night would not be forgotten. Something inside him shifted, a quiet resolve hardening like steel. The humiliation was a wound, but it was also the spark of something that would not be extinguished. The next morning broke heavy and gray, clouds hanging low over the town as if the sky itself carried yesterday's weight. Malik arrived at the country club early, as he always did, his shoes polished, his uniform crisp. The sting of Charles Whitmore's words still lingered in him, echoing in the quiet spaces of his mind. But Malik had learned long ago that the world rarely gave second chances to men like him. The only way forward was to keep moving, steady and deliberate, no matter the noise around him. He tied his apron in the locker room, straightened his tie in the mirror, and walked onto the floor just as the first guest began to arrive. The rhythm of service was a kind of armor. Take the order, pour the drink, clear the plate. Routine, predictable, safe. But halfway through the morning shift, the manager, Mr. Collins, a thin man with slick back hair and a perpetual frown, tapped him on the shoulder. "Malik, my office. Now." The tone was clipped cold. Malik followed him down the narrow hallway lined with framed photographs of the club's founding members, all white men in tuxedos, their smiles frozen in sepia. Inside the office, Collins shut the door with a soft but final click. "There's been a complaint," he said, lowering himself into the leather chair behind his desk. He folded his hands on the desk as though bracing himself for what he was about to say. "Last night, some cash went missing from the register." Malik blinked, confused. "Sir, I don't—" Collins raised a hand to silence him. "Charles Whitmore mentioned it to me personally. Said he saw you lingering near the counter. Now, I've always said you were one of our better workers, but this doesn't look good." The words hit Malik like a blow, but he kept his face still. "With all respect, Mr. Collins, I didn't take anything. I never even touched the register." Collins sighed as though the matter pained him, though his eyes carried none of that sorrow. "Be that as it may, The board doesn't want trouble. For now, you're suspended until we sort this out. Suspended? Malik's voice was quiet, but beneath it was a tremor of disbelief. His rent was due next week. His grandmother's medication cost nearly half his paycheck. You don't have any evidence. Just his word. Collins leaned back, his expression stiff. Sometimes a man's word carries more weight than evidence. The sentence landed heavy in the air. Malik understood its meaning. Charles Whitmore's word was law in this town. Against it, his own truth weighed nothing. When Malik stepped out of the office, the hallway seemed narrower, the walls pressing in. A couple of staff members looked up as he passed, their eyes full of questions but their mouths shut tight. No one wanted to risk their own livelihood by standing beside him. By evening, the whispers had already begun. A few guests murmured as he walked past the lobby, their glances sharp, their smiles thin. "That's him," someone said under their breath. "Got caught stealing." The story was spreading like wildfire, reshaping his reputation faster than he could defend himself. He drove home in silence, the weight of it pressing on his chest. When he stepped into the apartment, Miss Evelyn was sitting in her armchair, knitting with slow, steady hands. She looked up at him, reading the truth in his face before he spoke. "What happened, baby?" "They suspended me," Malik said, his voice low, almost ashamed though he had done nothing wrong. "They think I stole money." Charles Whitmore said, "He saw me near the register." Miss Evelyn set her knitting aside, her fingers trembling slightly. She studied her grandson, the boy she had raised into a man of quiet strength. "And what did you do?" "I told the truth." His eyes burned, but no tears came. "Didn't matter." She nodded slowly, as though she had expected nothing else. Her voice was soft but firm when she answered. "The truth always matters, Malik. It may not matter to them right now, but it matters to God, and it matters to you. Don't let them take that from you." Malik sat across from her, the anger coiled tight inside his chest. He wanted to shout, to rage against the walls of injustice closing in around him, but instead, he breathed deeply, letting the words settle in him. Dignity, his grandmother always said, was not in what people saw. It was in what you carried when no one else was looking. That night, Malik lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed. A message from Amelia lit up the screen. "I heard what happened. I'm so sorry. Don't give up. I'm with you." He stared at the words, the corners of his mouth, lifting slightly despite the storm raging inside him. He typed a reply slowly, deliberately. "I won't. I promise." And though the world seemed determined to break him, Malik felt something shifting deep inside, a quiet resolve, sharp as glass. 2 days after his suspension, Malik sat at the worn oak table in his grandmother's kitchen. Paper spread before him like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. Old notebooks filled with statistics, highlighted printouts of labor reports, and a thick stack of his MBA coursework lay scattered across the surface. He hadn't opened these files in months, but now, in the silence of forced unemployment, he found himself drawn back into the work that had kept him alive through long nights of exhaustion. Miss Evelyn shuffled into the kitchen, her robe tied loosely around her frame, and set a cup of tea beside him. She looked down at the documents with a knowing eye. "You're digging again," she said softly. Malik gave a tired smile. "Feels like the only thing I got left." But it wasn't just a distraction. It was a lifeline. Malik had spent the last 2 years building his thesis on corporate corruption and systemic labor abuse, focusing specifically on how companies like Whitmore Industries exploited black workers. He had traced patterns of underpayment, unsafe working conditions, and discriminatory hiring practices. His professors had called it one of the most damning and well-researched papers they'd ever read. Malik hadn't thought much of it at the time. It was just academic work, a way to finish his degree. But now, staring at the piles of evidence, he realized it was more than theory. It was a weapon. The doorbell rang. Malik rose to answer it and found Amelia standing there, her face pale from worry, but her eyes blazing with determination. She stepped inside quickly, as though she were sneaking past the world's judgment. "They're lying about you," she said, not wasting a moment. "I heard my father on the phone. He pushed Collins to suspend you. He wants to make sure you're ruined, Malik. He thinks if he breaks you, I'll come back to him. Malik clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. That's exactly what he wants, for me to lose everything. Amelia's gaze fell on the papers scattered across the table. What is all this? My research, Malik said, his voice low but steady. I spent years studying his company. I know things most people don't. Things he doesn't want anyone to know. She picked up one of the pages, her fingers trembling slightly. It was a chart showing wage disparities between black workers and their white counterparts over the past decade. Beneath it was a detailed breakdown of safety violations at one of the company's plants, incidents that had left several employees permanently injured, none of whom had received fair compensation. Amelia's breath caught. He's been hiding this. He's been burying it, Malik corrected. But it's all here. I didn't realize it before, but this... He gestured to the mountain of papers. This isn't just my thesis. It's evidence. Amelia looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. In that moment, she saw the man her father had dismissed as a waiter, a servant. What Charles Whitmore couldn't see. She now understood fully. Malik was brilliant. He wasn't a man to be pitted or ridiculed. He was dangerous to men like Charles, precisely because he didn't fight with fists or fury. He fought with truth. She reached for his hand across the table. Then let's use it. Malik hesitated. He thought of the risks. What would mean to challenge a man as powerful as Charles Whitmore? What would do to Amelia, to his grandmother, to the fragile life he had built? But then he thought of the men and women he had interviewed during his research. Workers whose names had been reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. Lives swallowed by the machine of greed. He thought of the way Charles had looked at him, the laughter in his voice when he told the men like him belonged in uniforms. No, Malik said finally, his voice calm but unyielding. Not yet. First, I want him to think he's won. Amelia tilted her head, studying him. Why? Because the higher he stands, the harder the fall, Malik said quietly. The two of them sat in the dim kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Paper stretched across the table like a battlefield map, and for the first time since the suspension, Malik didn't feel powerless. He felt the ground shifting beneath them, slow and inevitable. Upstairs, Miss Evelyn prayed softly in her room, her voice drifting through the thin walls. Malik listened, drawing strength from the sound. He would not raise his voice. He would not break his dignity. But he would not stay silent either. For the first time, he understood. His silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. The first crack in Charles Whitmore's fortress came quietly. One evening, Malik sat in the library of the small community college where he had once taken night classes. The campus was nearly empty, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead the only sound. Across the table sat Jasmine Lee, a local freelance journalist who often covered stories overlooked by the town's mainstream press. She was sharp-eyed, with a notebook always in hand, and she had once interviewed Malik during grad school about his research on labor inequality. When she saw his name whispered in connection with theft at the country club, she had called him immediately. Malik, she said now, her voice steady but urgent. I know you didn't take that money. But this. She gestured to the thick folder of documents spread before them, the charts and reports and transcripts he had gathered over the years. This is bigger than you losing a job. This is a story that could change everything. Malik leaned back, his fingers steepled. He didn't like the idea of being in the spotlight, of becoming a symbol. But he also knew Jasmine was right. The truth had weight, and the only way to balance Charles's power was to let that weight fall. Not all of it, he said carefully. Not yet. Just enough to show there's more here than they want people to believe. The first article appeared in Jasmine's online column the next morning. The headline was simple, almost cautious. Are black workers being exploited by Whitmore Industries? The piece detailed wage disparities and referenced Malik's research without naming him directly. It was enough to plant doubt, enough to make people ask questions. By the end of the week, the article had been shared hundreds of times. Former employees began reaching out anonymously, telling Jasmine their stories. Long hours, dangerous conditions, paychecks that never matched the promises. The whispers grew louder, and for the first time, Charles Whitmore's name was not spoken with respect, but with suspicion. At the grocery store, Malik overheard two men talking near the produce aisle. They say Whitmore's been underpaying his workers for years. Wouldn't surprise me. My cousin worked at the plant. Said he got hurt and they tossed him out like trash. Malik kept walking, heart pounding. The story was no longer just his. It was spreading, reshaping the air of the town itself. But with attention came risk. One night, as Malik walked home from the library, a black SUV slowed beside him. The tinted window rolled down just enough for a voice to slip out. "Leave it alone, boy. You don't know who you're dealing with." The SUV drove off, taillights glowing red against the darkness. Malik stood on the cracked sidewalk, his fists clenched, every muscle in his body tense. He thought of his grandmother asleep in her bed, of Amelia waiting for his call, of the workers who had trusted him by sharing their stories. Fear pressed against him, but beneath it was something stronger, a refusal to be silenced. By the next week, the local TV station picked up the story. A reporter stood outside one of Whitmore's factories, interviewing workers whose faces were blurred, their voices altered. The footage showed broken equipment, rusted safety rails, and time cards that revealed impossible hours. The public could no longer ignore it. At church that Sunday, Malik slipped quietly into a pew beside Miss Evelyn. The pastor's sermon turned unexpectedly toward justice. "God does not sleep when his children are exploited," he said, his voice ringing out across the sanctuary. "The truth will rise, even when men try to bury it." After the service, several members of the congregation clasped Malik's hand firmly, their eyes telling him what their mouths could not. "We know. We're with you." That night, Amelia came to his apartment, her face lit with something between fear and exhilaration. "They're talking about you, Malik. Even if they don't know your name yet, they're talking about you." Malik looked at the papers stacked neatly on the kitchen table, the evidence he had gathered piece by piece, year by year. The storm had begun, and there was no pulling back now. He felt exposed, vulnerable, but also strangely steady. For the first time, the town was looking not at him as a waiter or a suspect, but at the truth he carried. And once truth has a voice, it cannot easily be silenced. The first meeting took place in the basement of St. Mark's Church, the same hall where food drives were held and children practiced Christmas pageants. Tonight, though, the air was charged with something heavier. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle, and around them sat a small but determined group. Jasmine Lee with her notepad, Reverend Carter from the church, two attorneys from a regional civil rights organization, and a handful of former Whitmore employees who had quietly agreed to testify. Malik sat among them, his posture straight, his eyes steady, a quiet anchor in the storm. He had brought his binders, page after page of data, photographs, testimonies collected during his research. When he laid them on the table, the room fell silent for a moment, the sheer weight of it undeniable. "This isn't just one bad paycheck or a few unsafe machines," Malik began, his voice calm, deliberate. "This is a pattern, a system built on exploitation, and I can prove it." He opened a binder to a page showing a bar graph. Wages of white employees compared to black employees in identical roles. One bar consistently higher than the other, year after year. This is company-wide, documented in payroll records. He flipped to another page. Incident reports from factories, broken bones, burns, workers maimed by unsafe equipment. These people were discarded like they were replaceable. No compensation, no accountability. The attorneys leaned in, eyes scanning the pages with growing intensity. One of them, Ms. Grant, a tall woman with graying hair and an unflinching gaze, finally looked up. "With this evidence, we can file a class action lawsuit, not just for back pay, but for damages. If what you're showing us is accurate, Whitmore Industries could be facing millions in penalties." Jasmine tapped her pen against her notebook. "And the media pressure won't stop. Every week I publish another piece, another story. The court of public opinion is already turning. If we sync our efforts, legal and press, we can corner him." For a long moment, Malik sat quietly, absorbing the weight of their words. He had spent years carrying this knowledge alone, never sure if it could change anything. Now, here in this basement, he saw the possibility of transformation. But Amelia's hand in his reminded him of the risk. "They'll come after you harder," she whispered. You know that. I know, Malik said softly, his eyes fixed on the binders. But if I don't do this, then everything they've done to me and to everyone else just continues. I won't let that happen. But Malik was ready. The plan began to take shape that night. The attorneys would prepare the lawsuit, Jasmine would keep publishing stories to apply pressure, and Reverend Carter would organize town halls to rally community support. Malik, with his meticulous records and first-hand knowledge, would serve as both witness and strategist, guiding the attack step by step. Over the following weeks, Malik moved carefully, quietly, but with precision. He spent nights scanning old documents Amelia had unearthed from her family's archives. Contracts signed in the 1980s that showed how Charles Whitmore had deliberately forced black-owned suppliers out of business by manipulating bids. He cross-referenced those contracts with county records, building a timeline of exclusion and exploitation. Each discovery felt like a stone added to pile, the weight growing not on Malik's shoulders, but on Charles's. The evidence was becoming undeniable. Then, one evening, as Malik and Amelia worked side by side at the kitchen table, Miss Evelyn walked in, her step slow but sure. She placed her trembling hand on Malik's shoulder and said, "Your fight isn't just about bringing a man down, baby. It's about lifting a people up. Don't forget that." Malik nodded, his chest tight with both fear and resolve. He knew she was right. This wasn't revenge. It was accountability. It was legacy. By the end of the month, the lawsuit was filed. Johnson et al. v. Whitmore Industries. The headline ran across the state newspaper. Within hours, it was national news. Charles Whitmore was silent at first, but Malik knew silence was just a sound before a storm. And when the storm came, it would come hard. The courthouse steps were crowded that morning, the air alive with tension and the murmurs of a town divided. Reporters jostled for position. Cameras angled high to catch the faces of everyone who entered. Signs waved in the air, justice for workers scrawled on one, and Whitmore corruption on another. On the opposite side, a smaller but louder cluster of Whitmore loyalists shouted back, "Protect our town," their voices echoing with fear change. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a low rumble of conversation until the bailiff's gavel struck. The chatter stilled. Charles Whitmore entered with his legal team, his face set in a mask of arrogance polished over decades of unchecked power. He wore his wealth like armor, tailored suit, gold cufflinks gleaming under the lights. He glanced at the crowd as though they were beneath him, his gaze lingering briefly on Malik before dismissing him with a smirk. Malik rose from his seat at the plaintiff's table, his shoulders squared, his tie neatly knotted. There was no smirk, no bravado, only calm, steady resolve. To the untrained eye, he was still the man who once carried trays across a country club dining room. But to those who had followed the case, he was something else now, a quiet storm, the center of a battle that had shaken the town awake. The trial moved forward with a dry rhythm of procedure. Motions, objections, exhibits entered into record. But when it was Malik's turn to testify, the room shifted. He walked to the stand with measured steps, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore the oath. Then he lifted his gaze, not toward the jury, but toward the packed benches filled with workers, journalists, townspeople, faces black and white, old and young, watching him with held breath. "Mr. Johnson," the attorney began, "in your own words, tell us what you found. Doesn't need my bias. It speaks for itself." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Finally, Charles himself was called to the stand. He walked with the air of. Malik leaned forward, his voice even but carrying weight. "I found a pattern, not an accident, not oversight, a deliberate system of exploitation. For years, Whitmore Industries paid black workers less than white workers doing the same jobs. They cut corners on safety, ignored injuries, and silenced complaints. And when I started gathering evidence, I was accused of theft to discredit me." He gestured toward the stack of documents on the table beside him. "Every page you see here is proof. Payroll records, contracts, testimonies from men and women who gave their bodies to that company and were cast aside." Charles shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. His attorney rose for cross-examination, pacing like a predator. "Mr. Johnson, isn't it true that you're biased? That you have a personal grudge against my client because of your history at the country club? Malik met his gaze calmly. My personal history doesn't change the numbers on those pay stubs. It doesn't change the injuries recorded in those reports. The truth, a man who believed the system was still his to command. When asked about wage disparities, he scoffed. If they wanted more money, they should have worked harder. No one forced them to stay. Gasps filled the room. Cameras caught every word, broadcasting them across the state. Malik's attorney rose, holding up one of the contracts Amelia had uncovered. Mr. Whitmore, can you explain why you altered supplier bids to exclude black-owned businesses from contracts with your company? For the first time, Charles faltered. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted toward the jury, searching for ground he no longer held. Answer the question, the judge ordered, but the answer never came. Silence spread, heavy and undeniable. The image of Charles Whitmore, arrogant, untouchable, cracked before the eyes of the community he had ruled for decades. Outside, the crowd erupted when the session adjourned. Reporters shouted questions. Workers lifted signs higher, and cameras flashed like lightning. Malik walked out beside Amelia, her hand gripping his tightly. Miss Evelyn was there, too, her frail frame supported by Reverend Carter, tears shining in her eyes. Malik paused at the top of the courthouse steps. The noise washed over him. The chants of justice, the voices of people who had finally found their courage. For years he had been invisible, mocked, dismissed. Now, standing in the open air, he was undeniable. Charles exited moments later, his face pale, his suit rumpled. The crowd hurling questions he couldn't answer. The man who once laughed at a waiter now looked like a relic of a world crumbling under its own weight. And Malik, steady and calm, did not gloat. He simply stood taller, the truth his only victory dance. The weeks after the verdict moved like a slow tide through the town. For years, the name Whitmore had been stitched into the fabric of every building, every business deal, every whispered conversation about power. Now, it hung in the air like a warning. An empire fractured, its weight no longer pressing down on the people who lived beneath it. On the night the final ruling was announced, Malik found himself back on the porch of Miss Evelyn's small house, the same one where he had sat months earlier, uncertain and afraid. The cicadas hummed in the summer dark, and the air smelled faintly of magnolia and dust. Miss Evelyn rocked gently in her chair, her eyes watching him with that quiet pride she carried like a shield. "You did it, son," she said softly. Her voice, though aged and worn, carried more conviction than any gavel. "You carried us all on your back." Malik shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. The truth was always there. People just needed to see it." She smiled, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "And you gave them the courage to look." The town began to shift in subtle ways. Workers once silenced by fear of losing their jobs now spoke openly about unsafe conditions, demanding fair treatment. Small businesses that had been shut out of contracts started to win bids, their storefronts glowing brighter at night. The old country club, once a monument to exclusion, quietly closed its doors, unable to weather the storm of scandal. And when its gates finally locked for the last time, many in town gathered outside, not to mourn, but to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Malik and Amelia built a different kind of life together, not gilded in excess but rooted in community. They organized scholarship funds, mentored young people, and poured resources into rebuilding the neighborhoods Charles had neglected for decades. Amelia, who once lived under the shadow of her father's empire, walked freely now, her head high, her laughter unburdened. With every step beside Malik, she rewrote her own name. One evening, Malik visited the courthouse steps where everything had changed. The stone was still cold under his hand, the echoes of chants still alive in his memory. He thought of the waiter's uniform he once wore, the sting of Charles's laughter, the humiliation that had burned in his chest. It seemed like another life, another man entirely. He closed his eyes and breathed in the silence, then opened them to the sight of children playing in the square, their voices rising in joy. The future belonged to them now, not to the ghosts of Whitmore power. In the distance, a reporter's voice carried through the air from a small TV set outside a cafe. Today marks a new chapter for Ashford County, as reforms are implemented following the Whitmore Industries trial. The case, led by Malik Johnson, has become a statewide model for exposing systemic injustice. Malik didn't stop to listen. He didn't need their words to know what had changed. Later that night, sitting with Amelia, he turned to her with a quiet question. Do you think it lasts? All this do you think it holds? She leaned her head against his shoulder. It holds because people saw what was possible. They saw you stand there, calm and unshaken, when the truth needed someone to carry it. They won't forget that. The moon hung heavy above them, casting silver light across the porch. Malik's hand rested over hers, his fingers steady now, no longer trembling with the weight of invisibility. He had not set out to become a symbol, only to clear his name. But somewhere between humiliation and justice, he had become more than that. He had become proof. Proof that dignity could endure, that truth could outlast power, that legacy was not built by empires, but by people willing to stand tall when the world demanded they bow. And as the night deepened, Malik finally allowed himself a rare, quiet smile. Not of triumph, not of pride, but of peace.